My name is Suzanne. I'm 42. And for the first time in my entire career, I'm terrified of something I created with my own hands. Because it's 2 in the morning. And I'm alone in my office with a stack of old performance reviews that feel like evidence bags at a crime scene. And as I flip through them, my fingers tremble so badly I can barely keep the pages straight. Not from caffeine or fatigue, but from the sickening realization that I can recognize my own voice in every sentence and I no longer trust it. I don't even like it. I'm reading words I typed 5 years ago with the confidence of a judge handing down a sentence. Employee displays concerning patterns of mansplaining and microaggressions toward female colleagues. And I stare at that line until it blurs because it's about Marcus. And Marcus, God, Marcus was a junior developer who mostly asked clarifying questions in meetings, the kind of person who took notes, who tried to understand, who wanted to do a good job. And that single line, that single neat little diagnosis I delivered from behind a polished desk changed the entire trajectory of his life. Within months, he was reassigned, which was the company's polite euphemism for exile, to a dead-end role no one came back from. And tonight, I finally let myself say the words I've avoided for years. I did that, not the process, not the organization, not concerns raised. Me, Suzanne, the human resources director who was supposed to protect people from harm, I harmed him. And as I keep reading, I feel my throat tightening with something that isn't just guilt, but a kind of horror at the certainty of my past self. Because there's no hesitation in these reviews. No doubt. Just verdict after verdict. And I can't stop thinking, what the actual was wrong with me? The worst part is that I can trace the moment it started, because I'm still sitting in the same office where it happened. Same window, same cheap corporate art on the wall, same humming vent that never shuts up. And I can picture myself back in 2019, earlier Suzanne, hair always perfect, posture sharp, expression calm, in that practiced way that makes people assume you know what you're doing. Leaning forward across this same desk and telling Marcus's manager, Sarah, that Marcus needed to understand his communication style was problematic. And I remember the righteous heat in my chest when I said it, like I was doing something brave, something necessary. He constantly interrupts women and talks over them, I told her, and Sarah nodded because she trusted me, because she assumed I had data, because I was the expert in workplace dynamics. But here's what's making my stomach turn tonight. I just watched the meeting recordings, everyone I could get access to, and Marcus didn't interrupt anyone, not once. He waited, he listened, he asked questions that were sometimes detailed and sometimes awkward and occasionally too long, but never aggressive, never dismissive, never the cartoon villain I painted. And the more I watched, the more the truth crawled up my spine like ice. I had decided he was guilty before I had proof. Not guilty of something he did, guilty of what he was. A man in my department who didn't perform deference the way I wanted. And that decision came first, and then I built reality around it. I told Sarah there were complaints, and there weren't. I implied women felt unsafe, and no one said that. I wrote, creates an uncomfortable environment for female employees, and I didn't have a single documented complaint to support it because I hadn't asked for one. I hadn't even looked. I just declared it into existence and watched it become official. Current me wants to stand up and scream at the version of me who typed those lines, wants to grab her by the collar and demand, what were you thinking? You absolute menace. You wrecked an innocent person because it made you feel important. Because you liked the sound of authority in your own voice. Because you got to be the one who knew what was happening when everyone else was unsure. And the twisted thing is, I know exactly how past me would answer, because I can hear her in my head like a smug narrator. I'm protecting women from systemic oppression. Suzanne, sometimes you have to break a few eggs. I used to say versions of that out loud, to colleagues, to friends, to anyone who would listen, and once, God help me, I even said something like, Marcus represents everything wrong with privilege in tech, to my assistant, Jennifer, as if that sentence, said with enough conviction, transformed my cruelty into courage. And Marcus wasn't the only one, not even close. I keep flipping pages, and I hit 2020, and there's David, a software engineer who was brilliant in the way you hope people are when you're building a team. The kind of person who explained things patiently, who took time to mentor junior developers, including women, without being asked, without needing applause, just because he believed people should get better at their jobs. And his fatal mistake was disagreeing with me during a diversity training session. Disagreeing respectfully, calmly, in a way that should have been normal in any adult workplace. When he said, "I think we should focus on qualifications rather than demographics when hiring." And I remember the room, the fluorescent lights, the forced smiles, the notepads, the compliance vibe. And I remember how my face stayed composed while something in me snapped into place. Because I didn't hear a viewpoint, I heard an attack. I heard defiance. I heard a threat to the little kingdom I'd built where my interpretations were law. And that night, I went home and told myself a story. David just revealed his true colors, I thought. Classic case of someone who claims to support equality but undermines it when it matters. And instead of talking to him like a human being, instead of asking questions, instead of considering that someone can care about fairness and still have a different framework, I started building a case. That's the phrase that makes me want to throw up now. Building a case. Like he was already on trial and my job was to gather evidence. I documented every interaction he had with female coworkers, and I twisted them until they fit the conclusion I wanted. When he offered to help Jessica debug her code, I wrote it down as condescending behavior, because I decided help was automatically patronizing if a man offered it to a woman. When he suggested a different approach in a team meeting, I labeled it dismissive of women's ideas, even though the suggestion was objectively better, and even though the woman leading that meeting thanked him for it. When he checked in with a colleague about a deadline, I wrote pressure tactics. When he spoke enthusiastically about a project, I wrote dominating conversation. I turned normal professional engagement into a sinister pattern. And I did it methodically, like a person who enjoyed the craft of accusation. Then I went to his director, Kevin, and delivered my most poisonous weapon, an invisible chorus. Women on his team report feeling marginalized and undervalued, I said. And the words slid out of my mouth as smoothly as if they were real. And Kevin believed me because I was HR, because I had training, because I spoke the language of institutional concern with the right level of solemnity. And David got transferred to a lower profile team, his promotion delayed pending development, and eventually he left the company for a job 2 levels below where he should have been. And I told myself it was accountability. Reading my own review now makes my skin crawl, because I actually wrote, impact matters more than intent. Like it was wisdom instead of a shield for my own aggression. And I can't stand the thought that I used activism vocabulary as a scalpel to cut down someone who was, in many ways, the kind of ally people claim they want. Then there was Tyler. And honestly, Tyler is the one who wakes me up the most because of how young he was, how easy it was to terrify him, how eagerly he tried to please. He was 23, fresh out of college, excited about his first real job in marketing automation, and he reminded me of myself when I was starting out, eager, nervous, determined. Except Tyler was a straight white male, and in the distorted worldview I was living in at the time, that fact wasn't neutral, it was indictment. He was friendly with Rachel, a marketing coordinator. They'd grab coffee, talk through projects, laugh about deadlines, the kind of simple office friendship that makes work bearable. And I looked at it and decided it was inappropriate because I needed it to be. I wrote notes like forming exclusionary relationships with female colleagues and views women as potential romantic interests rather than professional equals, which is especially grotesque now because Rachel was engaged to her longtime boyfriend and Tyler was gay. Not that any of that should have mattered, but it's proof of how little I cared about facts when the narrative served me better. I started monitoring his interactions like a detective who'd already chosen the villain. If he complimented Rachel's presentation, I called it infantilizing praise. If he disagreed with her timeline estimate, I called it undermining female authority. If he brought donuts for the team, I called it performative gestures. I turned kindness into manipulation, disagreement into disrespect, enthusiasm into threat. The moment that still makes my palms sweat is the Holiday Party Planning Committee, because it's so small, so stupid, so harmless, and I made it into a weapon. Tyler suggested holding the party at a local brewery instead of the usual sterile hotel conference room because it would feel more relaxed. And Rachel agreed. Other people liked the idea, and I watched it happen and thought, not that sounds fun, but he's trying to create a boys' club atmosphere. And I spun out an entire moral lecture in my head about alcohol venues, women's comfort, male social power. And before the day ended, I had typed up a formal complaint. Tyler's suggestion demonstrates a fundamental lack of awareness about inclusive environments. Preference for alcohol-centric venues suggests prioritization of male-coded social activities, indicates deeper issues with respect for diverse colleague needs, and I sent it to his manager, Bruce, recommending corrective action, like it was a safety issue instead of a party location suggestion. Bruce called Tyler in the next day and lectured him for an hour about sensitivity, and Tyler walked out looking like he'd been punched in the chest. And after that, he changed, and I noticed it, and I told myself it was progress. He stopped speaking freely in meetings, stopped joking, stopped volunteering ideas, declined group lunches, worked with his head down, became smaller, and I sat in this very chair and thought, good, he's finally learning. When what I'd actually done was train a young man to fear social contact, to treat every interaction like a trap. And that isn't progress, it's damage. 6 months later, he was up for his first review and potential promotion, and he had excellent metrics, strong client feedback, the kind of record you're supposed to reward. And I made sure his review included my careful poison. While Tyler demonstrates technical competence, he requires ongoing coaching regarding inclusive communication, learning curve on cultural sensitivity, slower than expected, which was bureaucratic nonsense designed to sound objective while blocking him from moving forward. And he quit 3 weeks later, and years afterward, I learned he struggled to get hired because references travel and rumors stick, and HR-coded language can ruin someone without ever stating a fact. And he spent months unemployed, moved back in with his parents, took a job beneath his skills, and all of that happened because I needed him to be guilty of something, and my job gave me the power to make it so. Tonight, as I keep reading, I find at least a dozen more names, smaller tragedies, the same pattern repeated like a signature. Alex in accounting, who questioned the schedule for mandatory training and suddenly had resistance to diversity initiatives in his file. James in product development, who raised concerns about hiring targets and magically developed a pattern of insensitive comments. Robert in customer service, who pointed out that our harassment training examples seemed biased and got transferred to a department where he couldn't advance. And every time it's the same mechanism. A normal person expresses a thought. I interpret it as moral failure. I document it as danger. Managers defer to my expertise, and a career shifts sideways into a ditch. I used to feel like a crusader. Now I look back and I see something closer to an inquisitor, hunting heretics, except the heresy was being imperfectly aligned with my ideology, or being male and insufficiently apologetic about it. When I picture those men as real people, not patterns, not privilege, not problematic behavior, my chest aches. Marcus had a pregnant wife when I tagged him as harmful. David was supporting a disabled father. Tyler was paying off student loans and trying to build a life, and I crushed them to feed my ego. And yes, ego is the word I've been avoiding, but it's the truth. Because I remember the rush, the way power tasted when I realized how much influence HR actually has when no one questions you, when you speak in the language of risk and liability and culture, when you imply that dissent is danger. Directors and managers would lean in when I spoke. People would treat my opinions like diagnoses. Employees would walk on eggshells around me, and I pretended it was because they respected the mission. But the uglier truth is, they were afraid, and I liked that. I loved calling someone into my office and watching their face shift as I delivered accusations wrapped in soft HR phrasing. We've received some concerns about your communication style. Some colleagues have felt uncomfortable. This isn't disciplinary, but we want to address it before it escalates. Always vague enough to avoid something you could litigate, always sharp enough to scare them into confession. And I watched grown men apologize for crimes that didn't exist, watched them scramble to prove they were good, and it fed something in me that I mistook for righteousness. The women in the office started treating me like some kind of hero, telling each other, Suzanne really advocates for us. She's not afraid to call out problematic behavior. And they had no idea how often I was manufacturing the smoke so I could arrive dramatically with the fire extinguisher, like an arsonist craving praise for putting out flames. I kept detailed files, stupid little bullet points that look insane now, used phrase you guys with mixed group, offered unsolicited advice on timeline, spoke assertively in stand up, and I treated every ordinary interaction as evidence of a hidden war. And then I created mandatory workshops where I could lecture captive audiences about microaggressions and impact over intent, about men needing to step back and amplify women. And I remember scanning the room and seeing the discomfort on men's faces and knowing that disagreeing out loud could make them my next project. And I called that accountability when it was actually intimidation. So what broke the spell? Not a sudden epiphany, not a single article, not a brave coworker confronting me, because no one did. Not really. The system was too polite and too afraid and too invested in my expertise. The breaking point was an email that arrived last month with a subject line so simple it felt like a hand on my throat. Following up on 2019 performance review. And the sender was Marcus. And I stared at his name in my inbox for 20 minutes like it might bite me. And when I finally opened it, the message was calm, polite, almost gentle, the kind of tone that makes your guilt louder because it isn't fighting you. He said he hoped I was well, that he'd been working with a career coach to improve his communication. But he couldn't understand what specific behaviors were considered problematic. And could we schedule a brief call so he could avoid repeating mistakes? And I read that email over and over until the words felt carved into my ribs. Because Marcus had spent years believing he was dangerous. He had been paying money to a coach, analyzing his tone, rehearsing conversations, trying to fix something I invented. And I started crying right here at my desk because the truth hit me in the most brutal way possible. My paperwork wasn't just career damage, it was psychological damage. It was a story I had planted in someone's mind about who they were, and it had grown into shame. I couldn't respond right away, because how do you tell someone the thing you've been trying to repair in yourself is a lie I used for my own gratification? I drafted messages and deleted them, drafted again, deleted again, because every honest version sounded monstrous, and every soft version sounded like more manipulation. And finally, I asked him to meet in person and offered to drive to his city and let him pick the place. And we met in a downtown coffee shop where the chairs were hard and the music was too loud and the sunlight felt cruelly normal for the kind of conversation we were about to have. Marcus looked older than I remembered. Not just older. Guarded. Like someone who'd learned to keep a piece of himself behind glass. And he started talking about the past few years. About workshops on active listening. About inclusive language. About monitoring himself for signs of mansplaining. About practicing with his wife. And listening to him was like watching someone faithfully do penance for a sin they didn't commit. And I finally stopped him and said, Marcus, I need you to hear me. And my voice shook. And I told him the feedback from 2019 wasn't accurate. And I watched his expression change in steps. Confusion, disbelief, then something sharp and wounded. And I told him the truth. Not a half-truth, not a carefully branded confession. The truth. That I had fabricated complaints, that I had twisted innocent behavior, that I had abused my authority, that I had been addicted to the feeling of power. And when he asked the question I dreaded, why? I said it out loud in that coffee shop with strangers sipping lattes around us. Because it made me feel powerful. Because I could. Because I told myself hurting individual men was justified to advance women collectively. Because I was wrong, and I was cruel, and I was drunk on control. Marcus stared at me like I'd confessed to being from another planet. Then he said, very quietly, You destroyed my confidence for years because it felt good. And his hands clenched and unclenched on the table, and he told me about therapy sessions, about anxiety, about apologizing for normal conversations until his wife thought he was breaking down, about questioning his friendships with women, about believing he was inherently harmful, and I wanted to crawl under the table because the pain on his face was my signature. I told him about others: David, Tyler, Alex, James, Robert. And as I spoke, I saw the horror deepen because it wasn't just him. It was a system. It was a pattern. It was me turning HR into a personal weapon. And when he asked how many lives I'd messed up, I couldn't give an exact number. Only dozens. And he sat back like he'd been hit. That meeting didn't absolve anything. It didn't fix anything. But it demolished the last excuse I'd been clinging to, because I could no longer pretend the damage was abstract or temporary discomfort or necessary pressure. It had names, it had faces, it had consequences that lasted long after my righteous speeches ended. After that, I spent weeks reaching out to people I could find, and every conversation was a punch. David told me he started questioning whether he belonged in tech. Tyler told me he didn't speak up in meetings for 2 years after leaving. Alex told me his family thought he'd done something terrible because he wouldn't explain why he changed industries. James told me he started recording conversations with female coworkers to protect himself. Robert told me he still gets panic attacks during HR meetings. And each time I heard those words, I felt my old ideology shrivel, because what kind of justice requires innocent people to live in fear? I tried to make amends in the only ways available now. I wrote recommendation letters. I called former managers and admitted the truth about fabricated reviews. I paid for months of Tyler's therapy. I helped Marcus negotiate a stronger position with his current employer. I donated to organizations that actually support workers instead of policing them. And none of it felt like enough, because you can't give someone back years of self-doubt. You can't undo a reputation whispered through an industry. You can't subtract trauma once it's been absorbed into someone's nervous system. The most humiliating revelation of all was that the women at our company didn't need my manufactured crusade. They were capable, respected professionals navigating real challenges without needing me to invent enemies. And by turning legitimate concerns into a theater of punishment, I didn't just hurt men, I also poisoned the very cause I claimed to champion, because I handed actual sexists a gift, a living example they could point to and say, "See? It's all a witch hunt." And I hate that I became evidence for people who wanted to dismiss women's experiences. I took a leave of absence and spent 3 months in therapy, trying to understand how a person who started with sincere beliefs about fairness became someone who could ruin careers with a smile. My therapist said something that still echoes in my ears. The ideology wasn't the engine, Suzanne. It was the permission slip. The real driver was the addiction to control, the rush of being the authority who could define reality. That sentence was like a light turning on in a room I didn't want to see, because it forced me to admit that I had turned feminism into a personal religion with myself as high priestess, branding dissenters as heretics, crafting elegant moral arguments to justify increasingly aggressive tactics, and confusing cruelty with courage. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. I resigned from my HR director position last month because I couldn't keep occupying a role I'd perverted so completely. I sent a memo to the executive team detailing my misconduct, recommended an external investigation into personnel decisions during the years I held that power, suggested policy changes to prevent HR from operating as unchecked moral police, and acknowledged the legal liability I'd created. And yes, part of me knew the company would be terrified of lawsuits. But the point wasn't to protect them. It was to stop protecting myself. Some of the people I hurt responded to my apology letters with grace, some with fury, most with silence, and I deserved all of it. Marcus wrote, "Thank you for telling the truth. The damage is done, but at least now I can stop hating myself." Which wrecked me, because gratitude is not what I earned. Tyler wrote that my apology didn't undo years of therapy, which was fair. David said he'd never trust HR again, which was fair. Alex wrote bluntly, "Bleep you." And I can't argue with that either. I'm working as a freelance consultant now, auditing HR practices for signs of the exact abuse I used to commit, looking for vague complaint pipelines, unchallengeable culture language, undocumented claims presented as fact, systems that reward moral certainty over evidence. And there's a bitter irony in it. Understanding your own capacity for harm makes you better at spotting it in others, and I build safeguards against the person I used to be, like I'm designing a lock because I know exactly how a thief thinks. Even now, late at night, I still have arguments. I have arguments with past me in my head, but they're shorter because her voice has less strength. She used to thunder about systemic oppression and necessary sacrifice. She used to insist that discomfort builds character and that privileged groups need consequences. But those slogans crumble when you hold them next to Marcus's shaking hands in that coffee shop, next to Tyler's silence in meetings, next to David's stalled career, next to Robert's panic attacks. And the truth is simpler and more horrifying than any political framework. I liked the power to destroy people. I liked being feared. I liked being the one who could stamp a label on someone and watch the world treat it as truth. And I dressed that appetite in activist language because it made me feel righteous instead of cruel. Sitting here now at 3 in the morning, staring at the wreckage of my career and conscience, I can finally name what I was. Not a protector, not a champion, not a hero, but an abuser, hiding behind ideology, a predator in professional clothing, someone who took principles meant to support equality and twisted them into weapons for personal gratification. And that realization doesn't earn redemption. It doesn't erase anything. It doesn't pay back the years I stole from people who did nothing except exist in my line of sight. It just forces me to live in the truth without excuses. Marcus is still in therapy, learning to trust his instincts again. Tyler still flinches when he has to talk to HR. David changed industries rather than risk another encounter with someone like me. And dozens of others carry scars from choices I made while telling myself I was doing the right thing. And when past me whispers, pathetically, "At least you tried to make a difference," current me answers, finally clearly with no room for comfort, "I didn't make a difference. I made it worse. I didn't fight injustice. I became injustice. And the only thing left that resembles accountability is this. I will spend the rest of my life making sure the version of Suzanne who thought cruelty was virtue never gets to hold power like that again. And if I can help build systems that stop the next person with my same hunger from dressing it up as moral courage, maybe that's the closest thing to repair I can offer in a world where some damage doesn't undo. It only echoes." If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.